When we picture this space race of the 60s, we usually think of those iconic, triumphant moments, right? The heroic astronauts, the cheering crowds, the incredible technological leaps. But in today's Explainer, we're going to dive into a historical horror story that strips away all those happy, cool space race myths. We're going to look at the devastating human cost of unchecked political ambition and a story of friendship that is honestly as heartbreaking as it is awe-inspiring.
So right off the bat, ask yourself this incredibly heavy question. Would you climb into a death trap if it meant saving your best friend's life? Because the absolute crux of what we are exploring today is exactly this impossible choice. We're looking at a moment in history where a man was forced to knowingly climb into a fatal situation, completely aware of his impending fate, simply because it was the only possible way to save someone he loved.
Section 1. The setup. Political ambition versus reality.
Picture this. It's 1967. And the Soviet Union wanted a massive geopolitical flex for the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution. Their grand, rush plan was to launch two separate ships, Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 2, and have them spectacularly dock in orbit. But, like many rushed Soviet space projects of that era, the reality on the ground was incredibly grim. Put yourself in the shoes of a terrified engineer working on this project. During inspections, they felt absolute, paralyzing dread when they found over 200 structural problems with the Soyuz 1 spacecraft. 200! We aren't talking about a squeaky seat here. We're talking about 200 fundamental flaws in a machine meant to keep a human being alive in the dark, freezing vacuum of space.
It was an open secret among the crew and the engineers on the ground. The whole spacecraft was literally a death trap. Vladimir Komarov, the highly respected cosmonaut chosen as the primary pilot for this mission, knew this perfectly well. He knew his ship was essentially a flying coffin and that he would very likely not survive the trip. So you're probably wondering, why didn't he just refuse to fly?
Section 2. The ultimate impossible choice. Duty, friendship, and fatal rules. Well, Komarov couldn't just back out. It wasn't about losing his job or facing public embarrassment. Soviet rules at the time dictated a really grim reality. The system was entirely rigged. If Komarov, the primary pilot, refused the mission, protocol demanded that his backup step in, and his backup was none other than his absolute best friend, Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin was already a massive national hero, famously the first man in space. If Komarov refused to get into that doomed ship, the state would force Gagarin to fly it, and Gagarin would inevitably die instead. It's a staggering choice. Komarov had to choose between his own life and the life of his best friend.
Section 3. The pressure to die. Contrasting historical burdens.
To really wrap our heads around the unbelievable weight of this choice, let's step away from the space race for just a second. Consider the Japanese kamikaze pilots of World War II. These aviators faced radical expectations from their military government. They carried the incredibly heavy burden of sacrificing themselves for their nation and their emperor. In fact, they were literally given their own funerals before they even climbed into their cockpits to embark on these one-way missions. There was an immense, undeniable, systemic expectation to die.
You know, there's this pervasive myth that kamikaze pilots were chained to their seats, but the truth is actually a lot more systematic than that. If a pilot returned a first time, say, due to bad weather, it was generally forgiven. The commanders didn't want to waste a plane for no reason. But returning a second time, that resulted in violent beatings, and failing a third time meant outright execution for desertion. You were forced to die by the state, one way or another.
But here is the absolute game changer, the crucial difference. While a kamikaze pilot was violently forced to die under the threat of brutal execution, Komarov's situation was completely different. Komarov voluntarily chose to fly a known death trap. He wasn't doing it out of blind loyalty to the state, and he wasn't doing it under threat of a firing squad. He did it purely out of love for his friend. He absorbed the fatal flaw of the system, specifically to protect Yuri Gagarin.
Section 4. 24 hours in hell, a ticking clock in orbit. Now, put yourself right back into the shoes of a flight engineer on the ground on launch day. Imagine watching, helplessly, utterly terrified by those 200 flaws as Komarov climbs into the capsule. The rockets ignite and off he goes. Against all odds, he actually makes orbit, but literally minutes later, the instruments show the nightmare beginning. The power fails, and for the next 24 agonizing hours, we tracked his ship as it tumbled in a completely uncontrollable spin.
24 hours. Just imagine the suffocating dread in that control room. Listening to his desperate communications, knowing he was trapped in a tiny, claustrophobic metal box, freezing in the pitch-black vacuum of space with failing power. The agony of hearing a colleague, a hero,
fighting for his life while you are physically unable to help him. And that lasted for an entire day.
But then, something absolutely impossible happened. Despite the wild spinning and the total power failures, Komarov used his sheer brilliance as a pilot and manually guided that broken ship back toward Earth for re-entry. For one fleeting, breathtaking second in the control room, we actually thought his incredible skill might just bring him home safely.
But then came the final curse. As we tracked his descent, the main parachute completely failed to open. When the backup deployed, it tangled into a massive, useless mess. We watched in sheer horror through our telemetry as the craft hit the ground at full speed and exploded into a massive sea of fire. Those 200 flaws had finally, tragically, caught up to him.
Section 5. An open casket message. The final defiance.
Vladimir Komarov was gone. After the horrific explosion and the ensuing inferno, the recovery teams arrived at the crash site. All that remained of the heroic pilot was a charred 6-inch lump of melted bone. The force and heat of the impact had utterly obliterated the spacecraft and the man inside it. 6 inches. That was literally all that was left.
But here's the thing. Komarov had actually planned for this. Because he knew the mission was doomed from the very start, and because he knew the ship was a death trap, he had sat down with officials before he ever launched, and he explicitly demanded that his upcoming state funeral be open casket. He knew there wouldn't be much left of him to show, but that was exactly the point. This was his final, silent act of defiance. By demanding an open casket for his charred remains, he made sure that the military and political leaders could not hide behind pristine propaganda. They were forced to stand there and look directly at the gruesome physical cost of their rushed, reckless political ambitions.
So as we wrap up this explainer on this historical horror story, it leaves us with a haunting question. When political systems demand the ultimate sacrifice, where do we draw the line between duty, survival, and love? Vladimir Komarov's impossible choice reminds us that beneath the grand, sweeping narratives of history, there are unimaginable acts of selfless devotion. What would you truly sacrifice for the people you love? Keep questioning the history you think you know.